In this video, we'll be going over 10 of the most powerful pets that players were able to summon, excluding ones that people were able to steal out in the open world and use as pets. And at number 10, we have early Wrath of the Lich King Rhinos. When Wrath of the Lich King launched, they completely redesigned the hunter pet system, and basically added a whole bunch of new abilities to the game, and also introduced the concept of exotic beasts. This was a final talent that BM hunters could take, which allowed them to tame special beasts that other hunters could not. And one of the distinctions of an exotic beast was the fact that they had more special abilities instead of only just the standard one. Or just had an incredibly powerful special ability. And the special ability rhinos were given was called Stampede, which functioned basically like a shaman's thunderstorm ability, where on a 1-minute cooldown it could just knock everything back around it about 15 yards away. It was a pretty impressive knockback for a pet, seeing as shamans were also given a similar ability at the exact same time. Blizzard didn't think it would be a big deal at first, until it became apparent that it was kind of really strong in PvP scenarios. You see, most people will just kind of ignore a pet, as trying to kill a pet is considered a pretty noobish thing to do in PvP. So the Rhino could pretty easily position itself in a group of enemy players and just knock them all back, which could be incredibly useful at certain points in battlegrounds, like one of the bridges in Alteric Valley, the cliffs off the lumber mill, or pretty much anywhere in the eye of the storm. And a shaman would need to get their own body in danger in order to accomplish a similar feat, trying to run into the middle of people in order to knock them off, whereas the Rhino could do it a lot easier, and even had a charge to get there faster. So after the first patch, the ability was changed, and it could now only affect a single target instead of everyone. And then they made it add a bleed damage debuff to the target as kind of compensation for removing its wonderful knockback. Although hunters didn't have any bleed abilities, and it didn't provide as much damage as the debuff for Mangle, and did not stack with Mangle, so it was kind of worthless. However, even though it could only knock back a single target now, it was still considered too strong, so a patch later they just removed the knockback component from it completely, making the Rhino one of the worst exotic beasts you could pick, with its incredibly mediocre bleed damage debuff, which wasn't given anything else in order to compensate for the lack of the knockback. Eventually, the Rhino was given a knockback later on, but it was a lot harder to use and had a much longer cooldown, and wasn't really that big of a deal. It was definitely the earliest version of Stampede, which knocked everybody back, which was the strongest version of this. And at number 9, we have early Burning Crusade Felguards. In the Burning Crusade, the Demonology Tree of Warlocks was given a demon summon as their final talent point, which has become a staple of Demonology Warlocks ever since. And the first version of the Felguard, while it was a powerful demon, definitely the strongest demon they've had up to that point, which wasn't a temporary summon, it's never been anything too ridiculous like a lot of the other pets we'll be talking about later on this list. However, there are two things of note during the early days of the introduction of the Felguard. One of them was before they decided to nerf the Black Book trinket, which is a trinket which would increase the damage of your pet by 100% for 30 seconds, which wasn't that big of a deal in Classic WoW because the pets were kind of balanced around not being as strong as what the Felguard was. So as soon as the Felguard was introduced and the Black Book was still doing its vanilla WoW effect, you could legit solo pretty much anyone in the game during that 30-second window with just your Felguard. So in order to fix this, they just nerfed the Black Book so it no longer gave a flat damage increase, and instead just increased your spell power by a bit. The other issue was the fact that Burning Crusade kind of ran on an old engine, and people were able to take advantage of this by learning the Felguard through the final point in the Demonology Tree, make sure to summon the Felguard, and then just respec their talents to something else. This allowed Affliction and Destruction Warlocks to have a Felguard pet, just as long as they never died or they never tried to summon anything else. Eventually, Blizzard fixed this as well, by adding a system to the game where if you had a Felguard out, it would periodically check to make sure you had the talent associated to it, and if you did not, then it would just kill your Felguard. And at number 8, we have the Spirit Beast. This was another exotic pet added to hunters in Wrath of the Lich King, and pretty much for the entire history of being a pet for hunters, has shown up in competitive raiding, PvP, and dungeon environments, because the Spirit Beast has the ability to heal, and it can use it on other targets besides itself. And the Spirit Beast has had this heal in addition to being able to do full pet damage, as in the past, it was always part of the Hunter tree which was associated with dealing damage. And this heal has just been so versatile throughout the entire history of the game that there isn't really any instance where it was super overpowered, but it's just been consistently useful to a point where other special abilities have not been. And even surviving the purge of abilities in Warlords of Draenor, but was always inconsistent in how much it healed for. And it really reached its apex in BFA, when the ability was healing for around 50% the health of a player character. And also, coincidentally, BM Hunters were one of the best DPS classes at the time, So, Spirit Beast could contribute a massive amount of extra healing to world first races, using the ability off cooldown on the tank or some other low health target. And it was so good that Blizzard kind of nerfed it into the ground, cutting its healing down by about 2/3, and even after the nerf it was still useful and brought to raids. And while Spirit Beasts have had their time to shine here and there, they have historically just been good, which is why they're on this list, although not at a super high spot. And at number 7, we have Cataclysm Monkeys. Just a heads up, with how many changes have been done to pets for hunters over the year, they're going to take about half the spots on this list, as they are the pet class which has changed the most. So, in Cataclysm, Blizzard allowed hunters to train monkeys, and gave them an ability called Bad Manners, which was supposed to function like a rogue's blind ability, but only for 4 seconds. And this ability ended up being one of the best forms of CCs that hunters ever received, for 2 reasons. For one, the ability was just bugged and act like a straight up stun, so it did not break on damage and lasted for 4 seconds, and also didn't share stun DRs. And for 2, you could reset the cooldown of this ability by simply resummoning another monkey. Cataclysm is when they introduced the mechanic of hunters being able to summon one of their stable pets without a ridiculously long cooldown, just as long as they dismissed their current pet first. However, this was supposed to be balanced by the fact that dismissed pet had a really long cast time. And the best way to do this was to simply abandon your monkey since it was instant and free. And you did lose the use of it forever, but this could be done with a simple macro. And then you could just summon your next monkey, which was an instant cast. This gave hunters in Arena 5 uses of the Bad Manner ability before they ran out of monkeys to abandon, which means 5 stuns on 5 targets. And even if there were DRs for those stuns, that's still a lot. So, Blizzard changed this by fixing the bug on Bad Manners so that it no longer acted like a stun, and then made all the pets in your stable share a cooldown, so it was no longer viable to abandon monkeys mid-battle. And at number 6, we have early Wrath Gorillas. Before Wrath of the Lich King, Gorillas had a special ability called Thunderstomp, which was the only pet ability that had a legitimate AoE that did damage to everything. But it had a 1-minute cooldown, and was the longest cooldown of any pet special ability. So in Wrath of the Lich King, when they were readjusting all the pet special abilities, they changed Thunderstomp to only have a 10-second cooldown, while still doing just about the same amount of damage, costing about the same amount of focus, and having this special ability where it still generated additional threat. So with this new very low cooldown, Gorillas kind of became the best hunter pet overnight, as this AoE was pretty valuable in the days before everyone had reliable spammable AoEs. The start of Wrath of the Lich King is when they kind of started giving all classes good AoE, instead of it just being a mainstay of a few classes. And everybody wanted their gorilla pet with Thunderstomp because it wasn't an exotic beast, so all 3 hunter specs had access to it. And since everybody loved Thunderstomp so much in this new form, instead of nerfing it, they just removed it from gorillas and added it to the talent tree for the tenacity pets, which was the tanking role, as pets in Wrath of the Lich King had their own talent trees. So they could still get access to the ability, but at the expense of being able to choose a DPS talent, which means pretty much anyone who was using a pet to tank for themselves definitely took up Thunderstomp, as it was really great as one of the talents. And it's still a mainstay of pets to this day. However, it wasn't just Thunderstomp. After they removed Thunderstomp from gorillas, they gave it a new ability called Pummel, which works basically exactly the same as the Warrior's Pummel ability, where it could interrupt on a 10-second cooldown. However, when they first gave it to the gorilla, it had the ability to auto-cast the interrupt. And a little distinction about pets in this time period, if you could not use your pet's interrupt, or a dispel for that matter, then the game wouldn't let you use the ability at all, which means the pet would auto-interrupt the first time an enemy spellcaster would cast a spell, and never waste an interrupt on non-casting. And since it was on autocast, it was impossible to juke the ability because it was just too fast. So in PvP, you could just stick a gorilla on an enemy spellcaster you'd want to interrupt every 10 seconds, and there was nothing they could really do about it, other than try to cast a spell to get a different spell scroll lockout than the one they wanted to cast. So eventually they fixed Pummel and other pet interrupts to be usable even if there wasn't a spell being cast. That way if they were on autocast, they would just use it off cooldown instead of when there was a cast going on. So it was no longer a perfect interrupt bot, but could accidentally interrupt every 10 seconds, which is why they nerfed the ability again in Cataclysm by tripling its cooldown and reducing the lockout duration in half. And at number 5, we have Fireland's Fire Elementals. Now, the Fire Elementals for Shamans was always one of the strongest summon guardians they could bring out, because it was on a long 10-minute cooldown and dealt pure fire damage instead of physical damage, which means its melee attacks bypassed armor. And the thing was balanced around not being able to bypass armor, so it would hit like a truck. But it was also balanced around having an incredibly long cooldown, so it was not something you would see very often, and would only last about 2 minutes at a time. But in Firelands, Elemental Shamans had a 2-set bonus, which had the effect that every time they cast Lightning Bolt, they had a chance to reset the cooldown of their Fire Elemental totem. And Lightning Bolt is their filler spell, which means they use it all the time. And since the Fire Elemental existed for 2 minutes at a time, you basically had 2 minutes to reset the cooldown of the ability, so that you could use it as a permanent pet. And this was so incredibly likely that Elemental Shamans basically had a permanent Guardian Fire Elemental for the entirety of Firelands, and it was incredibly powerful, as Shamans were definitely not balanced around having a permanent Fire Elemental out. That would be like a Warlock having a permanent Doomguard or Infernal, except the Fire Elemental hit even harder than them. So while this set bonus was incredibly strong, and probably one of the strongest 2-set bonus that has ever been added to the game, they didn't actually do anything about it until the next raid tier came out, where they finally nerfed it, so that instead of having a chance to reset your Fire Elemental cooldown every time you use Lightning Bolt, you had a 30% chance to reduce its cooldown by 4 seconds instead. Which meant you could maybe have out a Fire Elemental for a full fight if you were lucky, but no longer a permanent Fire Elemental. And this 2-set bonus was nerfed again at the end of the expansion to only reduce the cooldown by 1 second per proc. That way you definitely could not be using it later on before they disabled set bonuses from previous expansions. And at number 4, we have Feral Spirits from Wrath of the Lich King. This ability is a DPS cooldown for enhanced shamans, which basically summons 2 Ghost Wolves to fight for you for around 45 seconds. And the Ghost Wolf summon had a whole bunch of special abilities, and more importantly, hit decently hard. However, the problem with Feral Spirits was that they were so good that enhanced shamans were basically garbage without them. During the 45 seconds of Feral Spirits, they were a monster of a class that was to be feared in PvP. Once those 45 seconds were over, however, you could kind of ignore them. Feral Spirits tried to solve all of the problems of enhanced shamans in one button. It gave them access to the Spirit Walk ability, which allowed them to remove all movement impairing effects and then gave them a speed increase by 60% for 15 seconds. Which was so good that it was eventually given to shamans as a baseline ability and removed from the Feral Spirits cooldown. The Spirits also had a bash, which allowed them to stun a target once during the duration, and they could trigger a self-heal. Basically, the Ghost Wolves gave shamans a way to have some form of snare removal, a form of self-healing, a gap closer, and a hard CC all in one, all on top of being a great DPS ability, which could be further enhanced with Bloodlust. Bloodlust or Heroism lasts for 45 seconds, which is coincidentally the duration of the Ghost Wolves. And back in Wrath of the Lich King, you could still apply Bloodlust to your pets. So they could kind of double up with the Bloodlust buff, as long as you just waited for the Ghost Wolves to be out first before you casted the ability. And this led to a very popular Beast Cleave combo in arenas, where they would partner with the Beastmaster Hunter, pop Bloodlust on all 3 of their pets, and then just let them loose on a low armor target. There wasn't really much you could do to actually stop the pets from chowing down, outside of a full immunity. The Beastmaster Hunter's pet would be immune to all forms of CC thanks to Bestial Wrath, and the wolves could break out of snares with their Spirit Walk, plus they auto-follow the target so there wasn't really a way to pillar hump them. And they were all hitting like trucks, especially since shamans had a glyph to increase their damage even further. And this wasn't even accounting for the actual damage of the hunter or the shamans themselves, only the nearly impossible to run away from pets. However, Blizzard eventually figured out the Ghost Wolves were a little bit too much of a band-aid, and gradually removed some of its utility from the cooldown itself and just gave it to the shamans, allowing them to use Spirit Walk as a baseline enhance ability, and also vastly reducing the damage of the Spirit Wolves themselves, to the point where, in a couple of expansions, it was actually a DPS loss to push the button to bring them out. And at number 3, we have Stampede. Stampede was the first mega cooldown that hunters were given in Mist of Pandaria, which on a long cooldown would summon all of your pets to fight for you for around 20 seconds. This was all the 5 pets you could have on you at a time, and the pets it summoned were literally the exact pets you own, which meant if they had special abilities, they would use them off cooldown. So if you had a whole bunch of pets that had really good special abilities, which they did prune a lot of them at this time so there weren't that many of them, you could get all of those cooldowns instantly, including a Spirit Beast heal, which if I remember correctly, you could actually macro them to throw all 5 of the Spirit heals into one target. This was a monster of an ability. There were so many balancing problems with allowing a hunter to summon all 5 of their pets at once that it went under all kinds of tuning changes, where they reduced all the damage of the pets to only a 4th of what they could do normally, they removed the ability for the pets to use their special abilities, so it was just auto hits, and then eventually they just got rid of the initial version of it and turned it into a wave-like ability, where it's more of an AoE that you can move out of, that summons a stampede of pets that damage whatever is in its area. But the original version of it was kind of crazy, and caused all kinds of balancing nightmares, even in the days of Mist of Pandaria where power creep was at the absolute highest it's ever been. Although that was the perfect space in which to release an ability like this, because if it was released in its initial form in any other version of the game, it would have been crazy overpowered. But instead, it was just slightly overpowered, especially when combined with all the other cooldowns BM Hunters had, like Bestial Wrath and the brand new Lynx Rush ability they were given. BM Hunters were the new kings of DPS cooldowns in arenas, which was a side effect of all the ability bloat at the time, which was solved when they removed almost all those abilities in the next expansion. And at number 2, we have Army of the Dead, the original Wrath of the Lich King version. Now, the original form of Stampede doesn't really hold a candle to the original form of Army of the Dead, which on a 20-minute cooldown allowed you to summon an army of undead soldiers to fight for you, which were basically permanent aggro creatures that would attack everything and spam taunt, and also allow you to win pretty much any fight in a 1v1 situation. The best way to deal with the Death Knight who used Army of the Dead was just to run away until it ran out. That is, if you could get away, with how ridiculously good Death Knights were in a hole in Wrath of the Lich King. Although, just like Stampede, the Army of the Dead was eventually nerfed into the ground. It didn't even last the full Wrath of the Lich King expansion before it got heavy nerfs. During the first patch in Wrath, they just straight up cut everything about the ability in half. All the ghouls did 50% less damage, and they lowered the cooldown to 10 minutes. But added a distinction where it could still not be used in arenas. Then in Worlds of Draenor, they nerfed the damage by 75%, and in Legion, they made the ability only usable by unholy Death Knights, and finally removed the taunt from the ghouls, as the Army of the Dead was also a pretty good emergency tank cooldown, so it wasn't a very good DPS cooldown because of all the taunting the ghouls did. So with Army of the Dead being a DPS only ability, it made sense for them to remove the taunts. The current version of the ability is still unholy only, has around an 8-minute cooldown, and summons about 8 ghouls each time you use it. So it's still in the game, but obviously not as good as the original version of it, which was like having a one-man army. And at number 1, we have Princess Yauj. This was a Silithid pet that BM Hunters could tame in Cataclysm, and was just one of the Silithid royalty from AQ40. As part of the encounter, you can trigger a hard mode by killing Vem first. And when Vem dies, she enrages the remaining 2 Silithid, Princess Yauj and Lord Kree. This enrage lasts 10 minutes and increases their attack power by 150% and their physical damage by 100%, so they hit incredibly hard for the duration, which is why that's the hardest order to kill them in. However, there was a bug in the game that existed for quite some time in Cataclysm, where if you tamed Princess Yauj first, made sure to give the Silithid all of its talent points mid-combat, and then killed Vem, for some reason this would trigger the enrage on your newly tamed pet, which you could then just simply dismiss the pet, feign death to reset the fight, and then grab 4 more of them. The enrage would not trigger if you did not give the pet all of its talents mid-fight. For some reason, that was the trigger that allowed you to gain the buff, which is probably why it went under the radar for so long, because normally you would wait until after combat to give your pet its talent points. And each of the Silithid you had with this buff got to keep the buff for the full 10 minutes, and it didn't go away when they were dismissed, so you could have a near 100% uptime on this enrage buff on your pet, and take it into any type of content you wanted. And this buff was massive, especially on the spec which was all about increasing the damage of your pet. And this has got to be the strongest pet that any pet class was able to carry around with them for up to 50 minutes at a time, if you had all 5 of your current active pet slots with one of these pets, with the full 10-minute enrage buff available. Even the Black Book Felguard only did 100% extra damage. The enraged Silithid did that on top of 150% extra attack speed. That's like stacking 5 instances of the Bloodlust effect together. Eventually, this bug was fixed though, and by Dragon Soul, it was no longer a thing you could do in the game. But it kinda went unnoticed for the first full 2 raid tiers, and I think that's because it just wasn't a very widely known bug, and it never really caused too many problems. And it wasn't until the bug started to become more noticed in the community that it was finally fixed. So while a single Princess Yauj with the enrage buff was probably not as strong as going against a Death Knight with an Army of the Dead, it was definitely stronger than any one pet that any class could summon, which is why I have it at the number 1 spot on this list.